Arcangelo Corelli. It has 4 movements, and you'll hear quite the contrast between the slow and lively movements, and you'll know when to applaud. Feel free to applaud at any point, because this conservative approach to applauding at the very end of a concert is a very 20th century thing. Certainly in the Baroque period they applauded between movements and nobody was embarrassed about that, so we certainly aren't. So here's a Corelli Trio Sonata in G major. Thank you. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to be able to play with my wife, if I can say that out loud. But also with Tom Marlin, who is a remarkable cellist and really an extraordinary musician, and brings me to the reason why I am here today at Xinghai's invitation, and that is to perform some music from essentially the Baroque period, but we're going to go a little later today as well, and discuss what that means and what we do in the ensemble Adelaide Baroque. The reason why I'm here in Adelaide is for Adelaide Baroque, and we moved here from the United States about 5 years ago, came out for a sabbatical, so my children could have the opportunity to go to school in Adelaide, where I went to school as a boarder a very long time ago. Well, it's not so odd for everyone here, but when I talk about my students and talk about last century, most of them weren't born then, so that's a very different kettle of fish. I was a boarder at St. Peter's College because my father went there as a boarder. He and my mum grew up in rural South Australia and valued the education so much that even though they'd moved to Canberra, they sent me back here. So I had a lot of really wonderful memories from that time. Came out for a sabbatical. Thought it would be wonderful for our children to attend school. They grew up coming out for every second Christmas and a few things in between, thinking Australia was a place where all their relatives were on holiday. It was always summer. They were swimming in their parents' pool or at the beach house, and nobody worked, and all their cousins were older, so they were spoiled by several generations of the family. I thought it'd be nice to not burst that bubble, but show them that Australia had a little bit more depth, and that, we have winter, not like where we lived in Pennsylvania, where winter was 4 months without seeing the front lawn. But we came out, our kids loved it so much they wanted to stay. They didn't want to go back to America, so that really facilitated, and we realized that the education here was really unique, and that it's easy to forget how lucky Adelaide is, how lucky we are to live here, because it really is an incredibly special country, and in a very special city here as well. So I'm getting a little off the topic, but we work with a group called Adelaide Baroque. In fact, just recently I took over as general manager of Adelaide Baroque. It's an organisation that's been going for 47 years. It's the oldest Baroque music organisation in the world, and I realise that saying something as a Baroque organisation sounds a little bit like it's a broken organisation, but what we do is we perform music from the Baroque period, which is roughly 1600 to 1750, and we perform it on historical instruments. So in a sense, we're sort of specialists in music. All of us have done an undergraduate, postgraduate studies in music, and then specialised in historical performance. So basically what that is playing the music of these composers, for us in particular, during the Baroque period, on the either the instruments of the period or exact copies of those instruments. And looking at our instruments here, you probably don't notice a huge amount of difference from the instruments that you'd see, for instance, with the Adelaide Symphony or the Australian String Quartet, except that we're playing with very different bows, and we play with gut strings, which is why it takes so long to tune. Gut is extremely temperamental. The old barometers used to be, there was a little piece of gut which affected the way the needle moved. So when you have massive pieces of gut like I have on my bass there, you can imagine that they don't stay standard very long. Any changes in humidity and temperature really affect the instruments. So we spend a bit more time tuning. And frequently people go, why are they taking so long to tune? It's not like that in other groups. That's the reason. But why do we do what we do? Why do we play music from these historical periods? What is it that attracts us to that in the first place? The intention for us is to get the music as close to what the composer imagined when he wrote it. So playing on those instruments or exact copies of them, using the bows and strings of the time, then going back and studying the manuscripts and the writings from those periods to learn about performing traditions, because they are really very different. So we all take on a little bit of the detective when we play and when we study and we prepare concerts. And the other thing is for us, it involves performing an enormous amount of music that would otherwise be lost. It's very easy, for instance, even in a trio like ours, to play a lot of later music, which is more readily accessible. It's published, and it has a great kind of common appeal. Going back and discovering music from different periods, one realizes that really from the dawn of time in Western Europe anyway, there were always fantastic composers. Beethoven may have been the first great rock star of music, internationally famous, and lived a life accordingly. But there were many musicians and composers who were hugely famous in different areas, whose fame didn't continue after their death. The piece that we just played by Arcangelo Corelli, he's one of the enigmas in music. Everyone sort of heard Corelli. He doesn't have anything quite as famous as Vivaldi's Four Seasons, but if Vivaldi represents the most famous sort of Italian composer of the Baroque period for most people have heard Corelli, or they recognize that name. And he wrote a tiny output. He really wrote 6 opuses of 12 pieces each, and that's it. And for a Baroque composer, that is minuscule. When you hear how many pieces Bach or Telemann wrote, it's like it would normally take 3 people to write as much as those people, their output. So Corelli wrote a very small amount of music, but when it came out, when it was written, it was published quite widely because he was very respected. So publishing music certainly in the 16th and 17th centuries was expensive and very difficult, but Corelli's music publishers thought that his music had a really popular appeal, and it did. And it didn't stop having a popular appeal. The music that we're going to play is slightly later, but at that time in the sort of so-called classical period after 1750, Corelli was hugely popular, especially popular with amateurs. And there's a explanation worth mentioning here, the difference between professional and amateur musicians. Today we talk about professional musicians with some sort of pride that we are professional musicians who are paid to do what we do, and we love it, we're passionate about it, so there's a certain sort of pride in being a professional musician, whereas an amateur is used as a slightly derogatory term, someone who's just plays it for fun and really hasn't, studied the great arts. But for all of the times that we're playing in, the things were reversed. To be a professional musician was a derogatory term. It's someone who had to earn a living playing music, whereas the aristocracy and the upper middle classes had the luxury of being able to afford to buy instruments from great composers, great makers, to commission composers to write pieces for them and to have their own sometimes private orchestra or band in their house. And they often had the luxury of having more time to dedicate to playing their instruments. So there's quite a number of great figures through history who were amateur musicians but phenomenal musicians. I just think it's kind of interesting because, in the classical period, or especially in the Baroque period, music was a trade. You were born into a household of musicians. It wasn't something special. It wasn't sort of that you just had an epiphany during school and decided that I love music, I'd like to dedicate my life to being a musician. It was really just a trade. You were born into a family of musicians. You learned to play music. And so that's how a lot of those things end up. It's not quite as fancy as it might seem. Bach wasn't touched by some divine destiny. He was born into a family of musicians, and he and his brothers and all of his children worked very hard for all of their lives. So I'm getting the nod from Heidi that I'm talking too much and probably got way off target. So on your tables is a program which has just come out. It's our brochure for this year for the music that we're performing. And I encourage you, if you don't know anything about Baroque music, or if you're passionate about Baroque music, or sit somewhere in between, please come to some of our concerts. Adelaide Baroque is kind of unique in the sense that we have here now in Adelaide a groundswell of really world-class international Baroque performers, people that have specialized in Baroque performance and come back. There was always a bit of a talent drain, particularly from South Australia, but from Australia generally, that musicians would do an undergraduate degree here and then go overseas for their graduate study and then simply not come back because there were so many more jobs in Europe and the United States and they paid so much better. So it was not a choice necessarily made for the long term, but a lot of musicians, live and work in Europe, and now there's a great swell of musicians coming back, and people also realizing that there is a career in things like historical performance in Australia. So it's quite exciting time for us. A lot of amazing players have come back just relatively recently, and there are fabulous musicians who are here already, including we still play with at least one of the original musicians who started the group 47 years ago, which is pretty wonderful. So we're going to play a piece now by Michael Kirsten, which is an example of a piece that is very obscure. When I first heard the piece, I'd never heard of the composer. It took me an enormous amount of time to try and find anything about him, any bibliographical reference at all. And there's really very little. He was born in 1682 into serfdom in Silesia. He was self-taught as a musician, not learning to read music until the age of 16 during apprenticeship of an organist. He bought his freedom and ended up having several posts as organist throughout Europe, wrote an amount of chamber music. He's best known because he wrote an autobiography, and a lot of the autobiographies of composers during the Baroque and Classical period make absolutely fascinating reading. Dittersdorf, who to bass players is very well known, wrote an extraordinary biography which is still available, and basically it laments how terrible people have been to him. And it's poignant and sad and an interesting study on what music was like at different periods. He's not begging is not the right word, but making a plea for people to take care of his wife and children, because it was not uncommon that once a composer died, when the income stopped, which would never have been massive, that his wife and children would have ended up being destitute after his death. So Dittersdorf's biography is very much in this, but it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek because he was a very wealthy man. So he just was greedy, wanted to amass more. Kirsten's is interesting because it's quoted an example of divine exaltation. And the last bit of his biography, if I can read the English translation, is quite fascinating. The circumstances of my life are wondrous, even laughable on first sight, but I hope they be regarded by the sensible reader as evidence of God's special guidance, as a reason for devotion rather than laughter. And that's how he finishes his autobiography. I think his music is quite extraordinary. It sounds quite modern in a lot of respects. So we're going to do two movements, the first two movements of this suite for violin, viola, and violone. Thank you.